The church bells rang out in the distance, signaling the arrival of the day Lena had both longed for and dreaded. Her son, James, was getting married today. And while the air should have been filled with joy, it felt heavy with something much darker. The moment she'd seen the invitation months ago, Lena had known this day would be more than just a wedding. It was a reminder of everything she'd single quotes. Lena stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the plain dress she'd picked up at a second-hand store. It was all she could afford. A simple, worn-out fabric that didn't have the shine or glimmer of the gowns the other women at the wedding would be wearing. The fabric hugged her frame tightly, making her feel exposed. The wrinkles she'd tried to smooth out on the dress mirrored the ones she saw on her face when she looked closely. Each line felt earned years of hardship, of sacrifice. "Why do I have to feel so small?" She whispered to her reflection. It wasn't the dress that made her feel this way, it was the entire situation. She had always known James' marriage to Sarah would be different. Sarah wasn't like Lena. She didn't come from a small, struggling family, barely scraping by. Sarah's family was wealthy, well-established, and the wedding was everything Lena had never had. From the lavish decorations to the expensive banquet halls, it was a world Lena had only ever glimpsed from the outside. Lena's fingers lingered on the wedding band her late husband had given her. She hadn't removed it in years. As a widow, Lena had known what it meant to struggle, to hold on to the remnants of love she had lost. But today it felt like even her memories were a burden she couldn't bear. She couldn't help but think about Margaret, the woman who had always looked down on her. Margaret was James' mother, but from the moment Lena married her son, she had been the outsider. Margaret was everything Lena wasn't: well-spoken, polished, and, above all, rich. She had never accepted Lena as part of the family. And though James had always defended his wife, Lena could see the discomfort in his eyes when Margaret made her passive-aggressive comments. The divide between them was as clear as day. But today wasn't just about Margaret. Today was about James. And Lena had promised herself she would make the best of it. She had to, for him. He had worked so hard to build a life for himself. This wedding, this celebration, was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. She would stand by him, no matter how small she felt in comparison to the other guests. The car ride to the church was silent. Lena sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap as they passed street after street, heading toward a world that felt entirely foreign to her. As they pulled up to the church, she saw the grandiosity of it all. The towering structure with its ornate windows and golden accents made her stomach turn. She stepped out of the car, barely able to breathe as she stood before the church doors. They were magnificent. They were everything she'd never had in her life. "You'll be fine," she whispered to herself, but it didn't feel convincing. She entered the church. But the moment she stepped inside, she felt like she was in a world she didn't belong to. The high ceilings echoed with the chatter of guests, all wearing fine clothing and speaking in polished tones. Lena, with her simple dress, felt the eyes of the room on her. The whispers that followed her made her want to shrink into nothingness. As she walked down the aisle toward her seat, she couldn't help but notice the difference between her and everyone else. The women around her were dressed in expensive designer outfits, their laughter ringing in the air like the clinking of wine glasses. They seemed to move effortlessly, as if they were born to fit in this world. She, on the other hand, felt like a shadow. But then, as she reached her seat, she saw her. Margaret, standing tall, her regal presence demanded attention. She wore a sleek red dress that shimmered in the light, and every strand of her hair was perfectly in place. The contrast between Margaret and Lena was striking. Margaret looked like the queen of this kingdom, and Lena was nothing more than a servant at her feet. Lena's chest tightened. Margaret's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment the older woman's lips curved into a smile that was anything but warm. It was the kind of smile that made Lena feel as though she was being sized up, judged, placed in her rightful spot. "Lovely to see you here, Lena," Margaret said with a voice dripping in sweetness. Though the words didn't reach her eyes, Lena forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her heart. "It's a beautiful day," she managed to say. Margaret's gaze lingered, her eyes scanning Lena's dress, her worn-out shoes, and then, just as quickly as it came, the smile vanished. "I'm sure James will be very happy to see you," she said. Her voice cold and dismissive. Lena felt her face flush, but she refused to let Margaret see the sting. She quickly turned away, focusing her attention on the ceremony that was unfolding. The vows were exchanged, and Lena watched her son, her only child, stand at the altar. His eyes filled with love for Sarah. He had grown up so much, and now, as he took the hand of the woman he loved, Lena couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and sorrow. She had done her best. She had worked so hard to raise James, to provide him with the life he deserved. But standing here, surrounded by wealth and perfection, she felt a crushing realization. She would never be enough, not in Margaret's eyes, not in the eyes of these strangers. The ceremony continued, but Lena's mind was racing. She tried to focus on the vows being exchanged, to feel the joy that everyone else in the room seemed to be experiencing. But all she could hear was the faint hum of judgment, a low, insistent sound that thrummed through her body, making her stomach tighten. She glanced at Margaret again, who stood in her designer dress, her head held high as she whispered sweet nothings to the guests seated around her. Lena had spent years in this woman's presence, trying her best to win her approval, to be the kind of woman Margaret might someday accept as part of the family. But no matter what she did, Margaret had always looked at her like she was a stain on the family's otherwise flawless reputation. Lena's thoughts drifted to their first meeting, the day she had met Margaret for the first time. She had been so nervous, so eager to make a good impression. But from the moment Margaret's cold eyes scanned her over, Lena knew she had failed. Margaret had made it clear that Lena, with her frizzy hair and second-hand clothes, was not what she had envisioned for her son. She was a farm girl, not polished enough to be part of the world Margaret so proudly inhabited. And over the years that judgment never faltered. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, in the way Margaret made pointed comments about Lena's upbringing, her lack of social graces, and her humble beginnings. She would never say it outright, but Lena could feel it in every glance, in every sarcastic remark, in the way Margaret's smile never quite reached her eyes. But today felt different. James was older now, and he was marrying a woman who came from the same kind of world Margaret was used to. Sarah, with her soft, perfect curls and soft-spoken words, had passed every test Margaret had set. She had the wealth, the looks, and the education that Lena could never hope to match. She was everything Margaret had ever dreamed of for her son, and Lena was just an outsider. The vows were finally over, and James and Sarah kissed, sealing their commitment to each other. The applause that followed was deafening, the sound echoing through the grand church like a wave crashing on the shore. Lena clapped with everyone else, her hands trembling, but it wasn't the applause she heard. It was Margaret's voice in her head telling her she wasn't good enough. Not good enough for her son. Not good enough for the life James had built for himself. Lena's chest tightened. The joy that everyone around her felt only seemed to deepen her sense of isolation. She had raised James by herself after her husband's death, sacrificing everything. She had to give him a better life. She had poured every ounce of her being into him. And now, he was standing there, a man who had everything, marrying a woman who had everything. What had she given him that could possibly compare to the life Sarah would give him? Nothing. Not in the eyes of Margaret, or the guests, or even in her own eyes. As the newlyweds walked down the aisle, Lena struggled to keep herself composed. James smiled at her, his face radiating happiness. "I'm so glad you're here, Mom," he said, his voice full of love. Lena's heart swelled with pride, but there was also a sharp, bitter edge to it. "I wouldn't be anywhere else, James," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. But then, as she turned to follow them to the reception hall, Lena saw Margaret's eyes again. She was standing near the entrance, her arms crossed, her lips pursed into a thin line. It was the same look she always wore when she deemed someone worthy of her attention. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was watching her, judging her every step. The reception hall was even more extravagant than the church. The chandeliers glittered with thousands of tiny crystals, casting a warm golden glow over everything. The tables were laden with lavish arrangements of flowers, and the smell of expensive food filled the air. Lena walked into the room with her head held high, doing her best to appear composed, but she felt small against the backdrop of wealth that surrounded her. The guests mingled around her, all of them chatting with ease, as if they had always belonged to this world. Lena couldn't help but feel like she was playing a part, like she was pretending to fit into a life that wasn't hers. She wasn't one of these people. She wasn't Sarah's mother or James' new in-laws. She was just the poor widow who had raised a son by herself. And that, it seemed, was all she would ever be to them. The tension in her chest grew as Margaret made her way toward her. Lena's stomach churned. She knew what was coming. She had braced herself for it, but that didn't make it any easier. Margaret's gaze slid over her once again, the sharpness in her eyes cutting through Lena's already fragile confidence. "Lena, dear," Margaret began. Her voice syrupy sweet, but Lena could hear the edge beneath it. "How nice to see you so presentable." She smiled, but it was a thin, insincere thing that made Lena's skin crawl. "I hope you're enjoying the festivities. It must be such a grand occasion for you." Lena forced herself to meet her eyes, determined not to let Margaret see the hurt that was beginning to rise inside her. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Margaret's lips twitched. "Yes, well, we do like to make things perfect for James," she said, the implication hanging heavily in the air. "I do hope you're not feeling out of place." Lena's heart sank. Out of place? Of course, she felt out of place. But she wouldn't let Margaret see how much her words stung. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret gave a tight smile, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Good," she said before turning away. Her attention already shifting to another guest, Lena stood there, her chest tight, her hands trembling as she watched Margaret glide away. For a moment, the weight of it all felt suffocating. She had spent so many years trying to earn Margaret's approval, trying to fit into a world that would never accept her. And now, on the day of her son's wedding, it felt like all of that struggle had been in vain. The reception was nothing short of opulent. The ballroom gleamed with golden light from the massive chandeliers overhead. There were towering floral arrangements at every table, and the air was filled with the sound of soft classical music that was supposed to soothe the senses but only made Lena feel even more out of place. The guests mingled and laughed as if they had been born into this world, as if wealth and privilege were their birthright. Lena moved through the crowd like a shadow, trying to remain unnoticed, but she could feel the eyes on her. She had never been comfortable in environments like this, where everyone else seemed so perfectly at ease, their conversations flowing effortlessly as they sipped champagne and nibbled on hors d'oeuvres. She glanced at her son, standing with Sarah, their hands intertwined, laughing with a group of friends. James had always been the kind of son who radiated warmth. He was kind, sincere, and grounded. He hadn't let his success go to his head, and Lena couldn't help but feel immense pride for him. But there was also a deep sadness in her heart, because today, it seemed, he was stepping into a new world. A world where she no longer fit. As she watched him, Lena couldn't help but notice how different he was now, how his life had changed. In the blink of an eye, she had raised him alone after his father had passed away, working 2 jobs to keep food on the table, barely scraping by to give him a better future. He had been the center of her world. But today, as she watched him with Sarah, it was painfully clear that he had moved beyond her. Her thoughts were interrupted when a familiar voice cut through the noise of the crowd. Double quotes. "Well, if it isn't the lovely Lena." Lena turned, her stomach dropping when she saw Margaret standing beside her, a glass of champagne delicately held in one hand. The older woman's eyes were cold, assessing as always. But there was something else, something sharp in the way she looked at Lena, as if she were looking for a flaw, a mistake to exploit. Lena forced a smile, trying to appear composed, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Margaret," she said softly, her voice tight. "Enjoying the reception?" Margaret's lips curled into a thin smile. "Oh, immensely. It's just perfect, isn't it?" So much money, so much refinement. Everything is in its right place. She let the words hang in the air, a thinly veiled jab at Lena's own humble origins. I'm sure you must be used to these kinds of grand events by now, she added. The sarcasm dripping from her tone, Lena felt her pulse quicken. She knew Margaret well enough to know that this wasn't a simple greeting. It was another chance for her mother-in-law to remind Lena of the life she would never belong to. I've never been one for extravagance, Lena replied, keeping her voice as steady as she could. But it's nice to see everyone so happy. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Happy? Yes, well, that's the most important thing, isn't it? Everyone has their place in this world, and some of us have worked hard to ensure that our children are brought up properly, given every opportunity to succeed. Lena could feel the blood rushing to her face. She had been silent for so long, always taking Margaret's sharp remarks in stride, but today, in the face of this display of wealth and perfection, it was harder to ignore. Of course, Lena said, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. James has worked very hard for everything he's achieved. He deserves this. Margaret's gaze shifted to where James and Sarah were laughing with their friends, seemingly untouched by the world around them. Yes, she said, her voice softening for just a moment. They make a lovely couple, but it's all so easy for some people, isn't it? You know, Lena, I often wonder what it would have been like if James had married someone from our world. Someone who could really fit in, someone who understood how things work. Lena felt her heart stop in her chest. Her mother-in-law had never been this blunt before. She had always been passive in her judgments, but this was different. The words stung, and for a moment, Lena couldn't speak. Margaret didn't seem to notice the effect her words had, but I suppose Sarah will do. She is from the right circles, after all. Margaret's voice was laced with quiet venom. Lena's hands clenched into fists and her breath hitched. She had heard enough. She couldn't take another second of Margaret's superiority, not today, not when her son was so happy. You know, Lena said, her voice calm but with an edge of defiance. James loves Sarah, and that's all that matters.
He's an adult now, Margaret. He can make his own choices.
She paused, taking a steady breath, and I'm proud of him. Proud of what he's achieved. No one can take that away from him, or from me. Margaret's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Lena saw something flicker in her mother-in-law's gaze, a brief flash of frustration, perhaps even a touch of surprise. But Margaret quickly recovered, her practiced smile slipping back into place. Of course, Lena, she said coolly. I'm sure you are. Well, I must go mingle. We wouldn't want to miss the toast, now, would we? Lena stood there, watching her mother-in-law walk away, her back straight, her head held high. The weight of her words still lingered in the air. Lena's hands were still trembling, but she refused to let the tears come. Today wasn't about Margaret. It was about James, about his future. She turned away, spotting James and Sarah at the far end of the room, surrounded by guests. Her heart swelled with pride. He was happy. He was starting his own life, but something was different in Lena now. For the first time in years, she didn't care what Margaret thought. She had done her best. She had raised her son, given him the best life she could afford, and nothing, not Margaret's harsh words, could take that away. Lena took a deep breath, her chest rising with new resolve. Today, her son was starting a new chapter in his life, and she was proud of him, no matter what the world, or Margaret, thought of her. The evening wore on, and the once exuberant atmosphere of the reception began to shift. The laughter of the guests was quieter now, more subdued, as the night grew deeper. The grand ballroom, which had once felt so intimidating, now seemed hollow. To Lena, its gilded walls echoing the emptiness that had settled in her heart. James and Sarah were dancing now, lost in their own world, their faces glowing with the kind of happiness that Lena had always dreamed of for them. They were perfect, together in a way that made everything else feel insignificant. The reality of the moment was impossible to deny. Her son, the child she had raised with such love and sacrifice, was now the man he had always been destined to become, a man of the world, a man of success, a man who had everything except her. Lena's eyes followed them across the room. Her heart swelled with pride for her son, but there was also a deep ache that she couldn't shake. The love she felt for him was bittersweet. It wasn't just the joy of seeing him so happy that filled her. It was the overwhelming sense of loss. The woman he had married was everything Lena wasn't. Sarah came from a world of luxury, a world that Lena could only observe from the outside. And while she had never been one to covet material wealth, the divide between her and Sarah, between the world she had worked so hard to build for James and the world that Sarah represented, seemed vast and insurmountable. She couldn't help but feel like she had failed somewhere along the way. Her thoughts were interrupted when a gentle hand touched her shoulder. She turned to see James standing there, his face radiant, but his eyes filled with something deeper, a sense of concern. "Mom, you okay?" he asked, his voice tender, the way he always spoke to her when he knew she was struggling with something. Lena smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, James, just taking it all in. You sure? I mean, if anyone should be soaking all of this up, it's you. You've been through so much for me, Mom. I can never thank you enough for everything you've done." His voice faltered slightly, as if the weight of the words was more than he could bear. Lena's throat tightened. Her son, her precious boy, who had grown into such a strong, compassionate man, was telling her how much he appreciated her. And yet, it felt like a hollow victory. She had worked so hard, sacrificed so much for him, and yet she could still feel the invisible divide between them. He didn't need her like he used to.
He had Sarah, he had this new life. He was leaving her behind. I just
"I don't fit in here, James," Lena whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I don't know how to be part of this world, this world of wealth and perfection. I'm just your mother. And that's never going to be enough." James' face softened. He stepped closer, placing his hand on hers. "Mom, don't ever think that. You've given me everything. More than I could ever ask for. You've been there for me, even when things were hard, even when you had nothing. That's what matters." Lena felt the sting of tears in her eyes but forced them back. "I just want you to be happy, James," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. But I also want you to know that I've never felt more out of place than I do today." James squeezed her hand. "You belong here, Mom. You belong with us. Sarah and we're family. And we wouldn't be here without you." Lena looked at him, her heart breaking at the sincerity in his eyes.
He didn't understand.
He couldn't understand the depth of her insecurities, her fears, and her feelings of inadequacy. But for the first time in a long time, Lena realized something. She had been so focused on trying to fit into a world she would never truly belong to that she had missed the point entirely. Her son loved her. He appreciated her. He needed her. Lena wiped a stray tear from her cheek, her heart swelling with emotion. She had raised him right. She had done her best, and that was enough. She had given him a foundation of love, and that was something no amount of wealth or social status could replace. "Thank you," Lena whispered. "Thank you for making me feel like I belong, even when I don't." James pulled her into a tight hug, holding her for a moment longer than he ever had before. The weight of the world seemed to lift from Lena's shoulders in that instant. She had spent so much time worrying about what Margaret and the rest of the world thought of her, but in reality, it was her son's love and gratitude that mattered most. As they broke apart, Lena glanced around the room. The grand chandeliers no longer felt so oppressive. The laughter no longer stung. She didn't belong to this world of wealth, of glittering perfection, but that didn't mean she wasn't part of the world that truly mattered. She had a family. She had James, and that was enough. Margaret, standing on the other side of the room, watched the exchange from a distance. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes cold, calculating. But Lena no longer cared. Margaret's disapproval no longer had the power to diminish her worth. Lena was more than the dress she wore, more than the house she lived in. She was the woman who had given everything to raise her son, and she could see now that that was all that mattered. The night ended with the kind of celebration that only weddings could bring. Laughter echoed through the ballroom, and the joy was palpable. But for Lena, the true victory was internal. She had spent so many years questioning her place in the world, but now she understood something vital. She had a place. And it wasn't in the shadow of Margaret or anyone else. It was beside her son, who had become the man she always knew he could be. As the last dance played, and the guests slowly trickled out, Lena stood by the doors, watching the life she had worked so hard to give her son unfold before her. She didn't need to be anyone other than the mother she had always been. And for the first time that day, she allowed herself to smile, truly smile, because she knew she had done enough.